to try and repeat everything that I say in those 30 seconds. Do we have any volunteers? Anyone brave? Break the ice. Aubrey? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so are we clear on the instructions? I'm going to speak for 30 seconds. You're going to repeat exactly what I say for the next 30 seconds, right? And we can keep our microphones muted. And then I'm going to ask Aubrey to repeat for us as much as we can. But rules are there's no notes. We can't write anything down. And at least initially, when Aubrey is repeating, no one can help her, at least initially. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with my 30 seconds. Everyone ready? Okay. All right, hello everyone. Once again, my name is Tomiko, and I'm the Healing Across Languages Senior Project Coordinator with API-GBV. I've been a working interpreter for about 7 years now, and I had the pleasure of working with a DV agency here in Virginia. And my working language is actually Spanish, and so I grew up with Spanish and Japanese in the household, but I have the pleasure of being a Spanish-speaking interpreter. Okay, that is 30 seconds.
Great.
So for another, okay, Aubrey, do you want to, or let's actually all try first. 30 seconds. I want to see everybody trying to repeat. Okay, ready, go. Okay, so that was 30 seconds. Aubrey, are you ready?
No.
All right, let's give it the best shot we can.
Yeah, so your name is Tomiko. And
Did I say your name is?
I'm sorry?
Or
Oh,
did I say my name is?
my name is. Okay, so my
Mm-hmm.
name is Tomiko, and I am the healing interwords coordinator at API-GBV. And this is where I was like, the panic kicks in. So I have been an interpreter for 7 years. I was at a DV organization, and the language I interpret is Spanish. Even because oh my God. Oh, and I know that you stated you also speak another language, and then that was the end of it, and I missed everything in between.
All right, thank you so much, Aubrey. Everyone, a round of applause for Aubrey. So
I did
brave.
it for y'all. Clap it up.
How did it feel for you, Aubrey?
For me, I think that typically when I'm listening, I always try and in general, like keep the important information in my head as like bullet points. But I think what was a challenge was actually making it dialogue rather than information. Like this was like you were stating things. And so even like you said at the beginning, I rather than saying she. And so I think for me, that was the toughest part, was like, even if I was cognitively trying to make those bullets, I wasn't able to like keep your like how you were presenting the information. And so that part was really tough to then relay because you're trying to do both. So that was definitely really tough.
Yeah, a lot of strategies that can be put into memorizing a set of speech, and interpretation for sure is actually in first person. That's always a red flag that I'd like to put on your radar, right? If we're talking in third person, that's no longer interpretation, right? Because we're not a part of the conversation. How was it for everyone else? Any other thoughts, any other strategies, or anything you noticed about what stuck or what did not stick? Alicia?
As an interpreter, of course, I picked up on your inflections of tone. and
Yes.
just and some of your rhythm of speech and things along those lines that I also incorporate, whether it's your speed and yes, your tone, your how friendly you are as you're speaking.
Oh, okay, beautiful. Yeah, so that's actually part of your skill set as an ASL interpreter, right? You're not
Yeah.
necessarily memorizing speech for moments at a time, but you're
Mhm.
actually simultaneously interpreting and trying to
Yeah.
relay the spirit of the message, the inflection, etc.
Yes, but
Excellent.
like somebody pointed out, it is very fast, and I definitely have an edge on spoken language interpreters because I can do it simultaneously, right? I don't have to hold as long.
Right. So there's a difference between consecutive interpretation and simultaneous. Consecutive is that pause interpretation that we're often going to see with spoken language interpretation in these settings. But simultaneous is the interpretation that happens at the same time as the person is speaking. Any other thoughts? Any other notes?
I think what's interesting too is like when I'm in court and I'm listening and I hear something and then I feel like I miss the next three things that are said. So our brains are trying to process all of this um, information instead of just listening to what the speaker is saying. And so I think trying to take notes to be able to copy something would actually be harder because we're going to miss so much in between.
Yes, how many of you actually heard my story, right? How many of you actually heard the spirit of the message, right? Because we're there, it actually takes a lot of cognitive load to try to memorize something, and the more stressed we are, the harder it is to actually retain information and recall it. Um, and right, the way that memory works generally is that you tend to remember the beginning and end of things, but somewhere in the middle, we tend to need a little bit more support to retain that information, right? It might be up there, but recalling it is a completely different thing. Right. So thank you all for participating in that immersive experience. As you all know, that is not necessarily all of interpretation of what it entails. You guys did what is called shadowing, which is repeating a phrase or a set of uh, a speech for from one language to the same language, whereas interpretation would be from one language to a different language, right? And so even if the message is, fairly neutral, happy, we can see that interpretation actually takes quite a cognitive load, even if we're just talking about memory. But then when we're talking about the setting that we're in, the cultural equivalents, et cetera, we can definitely consider there's a lot of skill sets that go into it. And so that's exactly where we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about understanding the role of the interpreter in language access for victims of domestic and sexual violence. So if you'll give me a second, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, so just to repeat a little bit about myself, like I had said, a lot of my work is informed by my experience being an interpreter. I was trained formally as an interpreter. I also grew up in an immigrant household where, of course, a very common experience is for the child to be the interpreter translator, right? And so a lot of my experience really, or a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is really informed by my direct experience as an interpreter, especially when it comes to working in the DVSA setting, which is a very distinct circumstance that a lot of interpreters actually don't have access to information about, right? I noticed that when we're talking about interpretation in formal trainings, et cetera, that trauma-informed piece is not necessarily a large focus. And so folks don't necessarily come into the space, right, with the support or the skill sets or this maybe the self-awareness to maybe handle this very sensitive and distinct circumstance, right? And vice versa, a lot of service providers I did notice, right, maybe didn't have the experience of working with a trained interpreter, because oftentimes what happens is that bilingual folks are put in that position, and even if it is well-meaning, it is not necessarily interpretation that is being practiced, right? And so my role at API-GBV is building the capacity of the interpreter pool, the growing interpreter pool in the DVSA setting, but equally important, working with service providers and learning how to ensure effective communication through collaborating with interpreters, because interpretation really is everybody's responsibility to make sure that it is working. And interpretation is for everybody, right? Everybody is an expert of their own experience and has important information to share. And so I like to invite folks to shift their understanding of, well, this person doesn't speak English and so they need interpretation, but actually we might be a party of individuals who are all monolingual or speak different languages that are relying on it, on accurate and qualified interpretation. So with that being said, our focus is going to be working with interpreters in the DV-NSA setting, and we're going to delve into the unique challenges that they face, the skills they need to develop, and the critical importance of their role in ensuring effective communication between survivors and service providers. And by the end, I hope that you will have a clear understanding of the interpreter's role and responsibilities and the complexities involved in interpreting for DVSA cases, and how we can all work together to improve outcomes for survivors who need that language assistance, and for you, right, who also need that language assistance. And so I'll leave you with some tips at the end for best practices and considerations when working with interpreters. And I invite interpreters in the room to chime in whenever, and if you have tips or experiences you want to share, please, I would love to hear from you, and I'm sure it will be helpful for everyone as well. And we're going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. So feel free to drop questions in the chat, and I'm going to be relying on my colleagues at CCASA to keep an eye on that for me. Right. So I do like to start off with definitions. So one definition of language access, which I'm sure you have been familiar with or have some sort of familiarity with, is that limited English proficient folks should be able to access information, programs, and services at a level equal to English speaking and hearing individuals in a timely manner. So I like this definition, although many exist out there, just because it allows us to ask ourselves, would this be happening if everyone in the room spoke English, or if there were a hearing individual? If we all spoke the same language, would this be happening, right? Would a child be interpreting? Would the neighbor be involved in this conversation? Would the person who gave them a ride for some reason be in this conversation, right? And if the answer is no, that would actually not be appropriate. It would not be appropriate for a child to be a part of this conversation, or the neighbor or the friend. Then likely it means that something needs to change, right? And next, I would like to hear, I know the interpreters in the room are going to already know this answer, but I'd like to hear from you all. What is the difference between interpretation and translation? Feel free to drop it in the chat, or you can unmute. Perfect, yes. So translation is written while interpretation is spoken or signed. Exactly. So yes, translation is the written rendering of one message from one language to another, and interpretation is the oral or signed rendering of a message from one language to another. And so I do like to flag this, right? Because oftentimes we will hear folks say, well, she translated for me, or I can translate for you. And what they mean is interpretation. That is likely a sign that they have not gone through the necessary interpreter training to provide qualified interpreter training, right? If an interpreter has gone through that training, it is a very clear distinction from the very beginning. The skill sets that we are developing are interpretation, not translation, right? Those are very distinct skill sets. Of course, an interpreter might also have translation skill sets, but what they are doing is interpretation, right? And so I do like to flag this for folks, just keep an ear out for that, right? Translation is not interpretation. And language interpreters need to have an excellent command of both the source and target language. That's really just the baseline. And we need that cultural competence and specialized knowledge in subject matter that is being interpreted. And so we have to convey the nuances, the tone, the inflections, the intentions of the speaker accurately, while maintaining clarity and fluency in both languages. And so it requires quick thinking, excellent memory, and strong communication skills. And interpretation is meaning for meaning. It is never word for word exactly, especially when it is spoken language. We are rendering equivalence and not necessarily word for word, because that would not necessarily make sense, right? That language just does not work like that. It is unique and beautiful across all populations. And so we tend to approach information differently, and grammar and syntax and all of those things differ widely. That just does not work with word for word. For example, in Arabic, I don't speak Arabic, but I have heard from folks who speak Arabic, you say, I go under the rain. Whereas in English, we would say, I go out into the rain, right? But if an English speaker were to say something like, I go under the rain, you might have questions about what I mean, right? And vice versa. I imagine an Arabic speaker hearing you say, I'm going out into the rain, might verbatim might have questions about what you mean. And so we might use those equivalents, but not necessarily use that word for word rendering. And another example, in Japanese, you would say, to whom I go, because that's actually the correct word order. But if I were to say to you in English, to whom I go, you would maybe look at me a little funny and say, what do you mean? Why? I would say, I go home, right? That's actually the word order that is most appropriate in English, and that's what you expect of me, right? So meaning for meaning, not word for word. And like I had said before, the primary forms of interpretation that we're all going to see in these settings are consecutive, which is the pause interpretation, and simultaneous, right? And so interpretation is not translation. It is also not advocacy, right? Bilingual advocacy enhances the advocacy services, as my colleague Jose Juan says, but we're not interpreters, or advocates cannot play the interpreter role at the same time. Being an interpreter is a very specific role, and there's actually no such thing as being an interpreter / advocate, although people do this, right? But there are very specific parameters, and there are professional and ethical reasons for that. So even if we are talking about interpretation in a community setting, we have to make this very clear. We go into a space, you have to decide which one you're going to be, because you cannot play both. When you come in as an advocate, you have an agenda, you have a goal, you're taking sides, which might not be met with having linguistic transparency, right? As the interpreter, I have the same goal as the advocate, right? We want safety, well-being, stabilization for the survivor, but we have different methods, we have different practices to get there, right? The advocate might provide that emotional support, the logistical support, maybe help the survivor make decisions, but the interpreter is only there for linguistic transparency and to make sure that everybody is part of the conversation. As soon as we're making a decision outside of word choice on behalf of the survivor, we're taking that decision away from them. So we're really not there to decide on anyone's behalf what to say or what to hear, etc. And ultimately, the interpreter and the advocate are a dream team, right? So the advocate can make sure that all of their bases are covered. Their advocacy skills are not, or their advocacy services are not in detriment or jeopardized. The quality is not jeopardized because they're having to think about memorizing the words, as well as all of the other details that they have to keep track of for the survivor, right? And so ultimately, we don't want to jeopardize the quality of either role, either of the interpretation or of the advocacy, by making one person wear both hats, right? And obviously, we can also consider the details around maybe compensating the person for having an extra skill set, et cetera, right? We really need our bilingual advocates in the room, and we definitely don't want to exploit them for the skill sets that they have. But obviously the reality is that there is a scarcity of both bilingual advocates and interpreters. So oftentimes folks have to be able to play both roles, but that does not mean that they can play them at the same time, right? We really have to decide which one we're playing when we walk into the room. We're also not sources of cultural consultation, although culture and language are very linked, right? And it's part of what we are doing as interpreters when we're rendering interpretation to find those cultural equivalents. We're not anthropologists, and we really can't speak on behalf of the survivor about what their culture might entail or what something means culturally, right? We're likely not from the same country. If it's a dominant language like Arabic or Spanish that have so many countries that speak that language, we're often not from the same region, class, ethnicity, age. And so the client remains the expert on their own culture, right? And if you have a question about culture, the best practice would be to ask the client about their culture. And we're also not emotional support. So we risk maybe saying the wrong thing, right? As interpreters, we're trained on interpretation. We're not trained on how to provide that emotional support the way maybe an advocate goes through that training or has that experience, right? And that also jeopardizes our ability to maintain accuracy and neutrality and impartiality. And although we might be tempted to help in a certain way that that goes outside of that linguistic role, we really, as interpreters, we come into the situation knowing that we help by just interpreting, right? And that is a challenge of that the interpreter faces a lot, right? We are in highly emotional circumstances sometimes when we're walking into the room at maybe one of the more vulnerable moments in someone's life. And last, what kind of interpretation is summarization? Can anyone tell me what kind of interpretation is summarization? So I'm hearing silence, and that might mean that maybe summarization is not interpretation. That's actually very correct, right? Summaries, by definition, you are choosing on behalf of the speaker, what is important to say, what is important to hear, right? You are taking parts of the message and deleting them, editing them for ease of communication. But what happens, right? That means that we're making decisions on someone's behalf about what is important to hear and or say, right? And that is not interpretation. Interpretation is accurate and complete in its rendering. And so, in other words, why is it important to have a qualified interpreter present, right? Because if the message changes, the results change for the survivor, right? Summarizations are by definition a change of information. And we can ask ourselves, would this be happening, right? Would this be happening if everyone in the room spoke the same language? Would I only be hearing part of the message? Would I be hearing a summary of this message, right? And that also might mean that someone is speaking on behalf of the survivor, right? Whether it's the well-intentioned friend or family member, we might be also potentially breaching confidentiality for that same reason, because we're using members of the same community to interpret, right? Which might change what even someone is willing to share about their experience. A risk as well is the denial of due process or wrongful convictions, and maybe abusers might even escape prosecution, which might jeopardize survivor safety, right? And at the end of the day, when messages change because of the interpreter or the translator in the room, we're jeopardizing the credibility of the survivor as well. We hear one thing one day, and then the message changes another day because maybe that detail was lost in translation somewhere, right? And we might also cause the survivor then to give up on the process, which leads to disempowerment, silencing, and re-victimization. Right? And we want to honor the fact that someone has chosen to speak up on about what they're going through, and we don't want language or maybe our privilege as a bilingual person to get in the way of that. Right? Interpretation in domestic and sexual violence settings differs from traditional conference or political contexts, which we normally hear about, where parties enter the conversation on an equal playing field. And in DVSA contexts, interpreters have to be very mindful of being an extension of the pre-existing power dynamics, because survivors may have faced numerous power imbalances and safety risks to begin with, right? And so unqualified interpreters might not have the experience of self-evaluating their skills, biases, their intentions. And so well-meaning bilingual individuals want to help, but do so by making choices on someone's behalf and end up undermining the survivor, right? So bottom line is, it is crucial to have a qualified, neutral, and confidential interpreter, someone who is not the neighbor, the person who gave them a ride, a child, right? And if the message changes, whether because the survivor is uncomfortable with the interpreter or the translator lacks skills or neutrality, it jeopardizes not just the quality of the services, but also people's safety. And this underscores the life-saving nature of language access. So again, we can ask ourselves, would this be happening? And what are, in the case that it is not clear, right? When we're talking about using a child as an interpreter, what are possible repercussions of that? When we're talking about qualified interpreters and having an interpreter in the room, I know that a lot of folks have maybe witnessed or been the child in the room being the interpreter. What are repercussions of that?
The child may know stuff that they don't need to know, or doesn't know the words to relate that information to the person who needs that. So, you know, maybe a medical term that can't explain or doesn't understand, to make it clear.
Right, exactly. So there are different dimensions to it. There might be trauma from the fact that they are in a conversation that is a very adult conversation and maybe requires information that otherwise you would not let a child be privy to. Or there's also trauma that comes from maybe not knowing the right word, not really having the memory skills. And so maybe you messed up the sentence or whatever it may be, and maybe the repercussions after that, or whatever happens to the parent or the family member, they might blame themselves, right? Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot in the chat. It might be traumatic for the child, and it would otherwise never be appropriate to put a child in that position, right? Yeah, information can get lost, exactly. So again, we jeopardize, there's collateral damage that comes with using a child as an interpreter. And of course, the child is maybe worst case scenario other than maybe using the abuser, which I have heard of before, and I'm sure others have heard of too. But obviously the spectrum is still relatable, right? In terms of using the neighbor or the family friend, right? Where the information might get lost. There might be a third party in the conversation. So interpretation is for and benefits everybody, and that includes English speakers. And so we're talking about, okay, we need to have a qualified interpreter. We need to have a qualified interpreter. So what does that mean? A qualified interpreter possesses those skills and vocabulary, renders equivalence, right? And when we're talking about equivalence culturally, we're talking about, words that come from a culture of the British common law system to another culture that might not have something that's equivalent, right? There's a lot of preparation that comes in before that to be able to render an accurate interpretation in that sense. We need to have a strong memory, efficiency and transparency in our clarification, right? We need to have cultural understanding, quick decision-making, very, very quick decision-making. And so we need to be able to enable accurate interpretation, especially in those high stress victim related situations, right? The more stressed we are, the worse our memory, the worse our rendering, right? We need to be able to stay calm in those situations as much as we can, or manage our emotions. And we also need to we cultivate these skills through extensive education and training, as well as self-reflection. So as you guys saw in the very beginning, right, there's a lot that goes into interpretation. There's a lot of stress, a lot of cognitive load that's happening. And it really does take a lot of practice, patience, and experience to do so ethically and accurately in this setting. So as you can see, that native-like fluency in both English and the target language is really just the baseline, right? All parties also deserve neutrality, right? for the interpreter, the message is our client. It's not the person who paid us. It's not the person who speaks English or the other language, or whoever we might have a bias towards. We come in, and our neutrality is a key facet of how we are doing our job, and the message is ultimately our client, right? We act as conduits for the message, and we never express opinions on or make decisions on anyone's behalf, right? We treat the expert as the expert. We treat the we treat the survivor as the expert of their own experience and knowledge, right? It's never about what I, Tomiko, think you should say or what you should know. It's just about what is being said. And so unqualified interpreters, friends, family members may compromise that neutrality, and that might impact investigation outcomes and further silence the survivor. And of course, confidentiality is a key component of this field, right? We don't have our work without confidentiality. We adhere to a code of ethics as interpreters, and confidentiality is a key component of our code of ethics often, right? So like I'd said before, the service provider and the interpreter, we have the same goal, right? We want the survivor's safety to be centered, their empowerment, stabilization, and well-being. We have specific parameters and guidelines to make sure that that happens, and that our practices are in line with doing our job the best possible way we can. And our code of ethics is how we make decisions, right? And we rely on them to make decisions in these tricky situations. And so this code of ethics might differ depending on the field, right? An interpreter in the medical field versus a legal setting is going to have a slightly different code of ethics. And there really are many out there that people adhere to. But regardless, a lot of these elements that you see here on the screen are very similar, and a code of ethics is going to exist if you are a trained interpreter. It is an essential part of any interpreter training, right? This is kind of what we start off with. This is how you make decisions. This is what you have a duty to as an interpreter, right? Just like you would want a trained individual in any setting to have a set of guidelines, standards for practices, etc., right? And so the code of ethics provides that crucial support for decision-making and practices, because interpreters are tasked with navigating very delicate situations, and we employ all of these elements in anticipation of the many challenges that we're going to face as interpreters in our position. So although our role is primarily linguistic, communication is affected by many factors, right? And in this setting in particular, trauma responses are an element that might affect communication for somebody, right? Which we are handling very directly. But those trauma responses, as you all know, vary a lot, right? From individual to individual. That's what we talk about a lot in this field, right? It's an individual's response. And so we as interpreters have to be ready maybe for communication that is ambiguous or hesitant, right? Which is not language bound, it's not culturally bound. It is actually very common regardless of the language that someone speaks, that there might be ambiguity, some hesitation around sharing information, especially maybe if it's the first time, if there's an element of mistrust in maybe the system or law enforcement, et cetera, that exists across cultures, right? Not just in LEP communities or hard of hearing communities, right? There might be inconsistency or maybe unexpected forms of communication. For example, someone who is not familiar with this field might be surprised or taken aback by someone laughing through their recounting of an assault, right? But that is something that folks in this field do see and are prepared to handle. Or the person might be hyper expressive in their communicating of what happened. It might, again, be the first time that someone has asked them what happened. And it's maybe the first time that someone has had an interpreter in the room. And that means that those pauses are very difficult, right? And so longer moments of speech, right, means that the interpreter has to be ready to memorize all of those details. And the more details that we're holding on to, of course, the more complex it is to render the interpretation. And so there's a lot of training that goes behind that. We might also even interpret silence, right? We have to be very comfortable with silence, which is something that service providers in this field are very familiar with as well, regardless of the language, right? But an interpreter that is maybe not familiar with these elements of speech being affecting their interpretation or affecting what is being communicated, this might be a little bit uncomfortable, right? And if the interpreter is uncomfortable, it is felt, right? And so again, interpreters have to navigate these complexities and be ready to navigate these challenges. And we might also be interacting with traumatic content, of course. That is, we are asking folks what happened, right? And we're relaying messages of maybe traumatic moments in someone's life. And so we have to be very self-aware and prepared to interpret anything that is said, right, regardless of how or what is said. And we also have to have those self-reflection skill sets around, am I the right person to be in this setting, right? Because there are many fields of interpretation that one can navigate and sign up for. And maybe if the impartiality and the neutrality can't exist because of the traumatic content, you might be getting in the way of somebody seeking safety or healing, right? And again, that goes for the personally triggering situations as well. That's why it's very important to brief the interpreter beforehand to really prepare them for what they're walking into, right? I have colleagues who maybe are not willing, right? They know that they cannot stay impartial and neutral and accurate if they're interpreting for a situation that involves child sexual assault, for example. But we can pass that assignment on to someone else, and they can take on a different type of session, right? And another challenge that we face as interpreters is that we're asked to step outside of our scope, because often folks don't necessarily understand the parameters that we have to abide by. And often bilingual folks in the community are the ones, right, playing all of these different roles. And so that's maybe expected of us as interpreters. But like I had said before, we really are helping by just interpreting. And so just another challenge that we face as interpreters is just reminding folks of our code of ethics and our parameters as interpreters. And like I had said, we are rendering messages with content that have maybe highly graphic information, right? And the way that interpretation works is that just like in communication, right, we are decoding messages and encoding them, right? So decoding means that we're listening to a message in one language. And if we think of language as a set of symbols that are attached to meaning, as interpreters, we're hearing that message and we're decoding it. We're stripping it of the symbols and just holding on to the meaning to then encode it and attach a different set of symbols to that meaning to deliver the message. So there are several layers, right, to this process. We're listening to the message, analyzing it, converting it, and delivering it, right? So we're handling the message up to 4 times, right? Whereas everyone else in the room is maybe speaking once and listening once. And so so like you had seen at the beginning, right? Even if it's a happy message, even if it's a neutral message, interpretation is very cognitively taxing, but then we add on the complexity because of the nature of the situations that we're interpreting for. And so that is why it is really important to have those knowledge, skills, and abilities as interpreters as a baseline to go into these settings, right? Any questions about this piece? Not seeing anything in the chat. Okay, so we're doing this. We're handling the encoding and the decoding, and we're delivering the message. Questions. While we're also aware of and handling those cultural equivalents, and maybe are noting cultural issues, right? Cultural equivalents are that baseline of what we are rendering, and other manifestations of culture affect the way that we communicate or what we communicate, right? And so the interpreter is handling that as well. And there are cultural considerations that impact both the technical and relational aspects of interpretation. And so some examples of cultural issues that might arise is that in certain cultures, direct eye contact may be considered disrespectful, whereas here in the US, eye contact is associated with maybe confidence, trustworthiness, etc. Right? There is meaning attached to that as well, or there are cultural norms that might restrict individuals from openly discussing their experiences that leads to ambiguity in communication. Or there might be victim blaming and shaming in certain cultures that causes the individual to internalize these attitudes. And while cultural issues of shame and silence affect survivors who do not need interpreters, the cultural obstacles often increase or become more complex in the cases that require interpreters. But it is also important to note that culture does not just belong to the person who maybe was not born here or speaks a different language, etc. Everybody participates in culture, right? Everybody, every setting has its own culture. If we think about values and practices and traditions and expectations, etc., the victim services field has a very distinct culture, as well as law enforcement, a lawyer's office, forensics, right? There are different ways of approaching the world in those spaces. So I'm going to ask the audience again a question. How do you guys think, or what are some examples of ways that you feel like maybe there are culturally distinct elements in these spaces? Or how does culture show up in these spaces? What is the culture in a victim services setting, or what are expectations in a lawyer's office, et cetera, that might differ from other spaces?
Maybe some of them may have a distrust already in it. And, if there's a distrust, there's a lack of connection, they may not understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult for them to relay words or connect.
You mean there's a distrust from the speaker or the survivor towards maybe these different
Correct.
settings?
For
Yeah.
these different settings, correct.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And that's going to affect what is being said or how it's being said. Totally.
And also, I would say a lot of these places may not understand the interpreter's role either and have resistance to even bringing us into causing even further communication breakdowns and just in their culture and their own business practices.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. There might be kind of a tradition or a practice of maybe not centering the interpreter's role in the importance of language access, certainly, for sure. And there's kind of a weight put to English being the source of information, or maybe
yes,
right,
just devaluing the necessity to have access equal.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I totally hear that. There's a distinct set of values that then translates to practices and different expectations that play out in these rooms. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, you would not talk to maybe your lawyer the way that you speak to your friend, and vice versa, right? A lawyer is not going to speak to you the way that they speak to their friend or family member, or they wouldn't dress the way they do at their friend's birthday party, right? There are different expectations for these spaces. There are different values and beliefs that are shared in the space that then impact the way that one communicates, right? And so I want to introduce you all to the high and low context cultural spectrum, which is a tool used in anthropology and linguistics to talk about the varying degrees of explicit and implicit communication. And so in a lawyer's office, right, they're going, especially in an American lawyer's office, right, they're going to expect, and what they want is very detailed chronological information, right, to build a good case for you. So they're going to be asking yes or no questions, very time-oriented questions. And so that might go on the lower side of the spectrum, where the shared implied meaning or the shared context is lower, right? we have to be very explicit and clear about what we have to say, or else things about what we want to say, or else things get lost in translation. So the lower side of the spectrum assumes a low level of shared context. And so effective communication is explicit and clear, right? And so US legal processes often reflect this side of the spectrum, right? And so, for example, also, right, we're in the US, I'm talking to you as a facilitator, as in the US, I have to tell you, right, what I'm going to tell you, I tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I have to summarize at the end what I just told you. And right, that is a cultural way, that's a culturally shaped way of communicating information to you. That is very much more on the explicit side of things. Whereas on the high context side of things, right, there's a higher shared implied meaning, there's a higher shared context amongst speakers. And so you don't have to necessarily say everything explicitly, and even, and there might even be disrespect associated with that, etc. But communication is more layered, it's more nuanced, right? You don't say things as explicitly, right? And so this kind of maybe clashes, right? There are different parts of this spectrum that clash with those yes or no questions, or with that chronological detailing that a lawyer might want in the US, right? And while that might happen, while there might be many elements that might affect the way that people communicate, right? The interpreter never changes the message for coherence. So while we as the interpreter are aware that the LEP individual might have a culturally distinct way of communicating, as well as the service provider who wants those technical details, they're asking those sequential questions. I, as the interpreter, might see a miscommunication happen amongst the speakers, even if my interpretation is completely accurate. But it is not up to me to make sense of and clarify the miscommunication amongst them, if this makes sense. So for example, right, you might ask a yes or no question. The lawyer might say, "Ma'am, did you get in the car at 10 p.m.?" Right? And then the survivor might say something like, "Well, they start to talk about the time that they picked up their daughter from the bus stop," and seemingly you're not answering the question, right? And so what happens? The lawyer might get frustrated or impatient or confused, and might look at the interpreter and think, "What just happened here?" And that impatience might cause the interpreter to maybe doubt themselves, doubt the interpretation. There's maybe definitely a perception on the line, right? Interpretation is a performance, right? We're performing, and so our performance might be maybe called into question, right? Because the person just said something completely different than what you just asked for, right? But the interpreter is never going to turn to the survivor and say, "Ma'am, that was not the question. You need to answer the question," right? Because then what happens is that the answer, what follows then is now the interpreter's responsibility, right? We're taking control of the conversation. Whereas if the lawyer says, "Ma'am, I need to have the exact times around the incident so that we can build a strong case, et cetera, et cetera," that is what the lawyer does, right? That's what the lawyer's responsibility is, right? And if maybe there's a cultural element to it, as well as other things like trauma affecting memory recall, which is something we're very familiar with in this field, right? Regardless of language, there are things around the hippocampus going offline, and it's hard to file away memories while there's trauma happening, et cetera. Service providers in this field know that sequential recalling of events is actually very challenging in these situations. And there are other elements too, like we had said, initial or repeated storytelling. It might be the first time someone is really having the space to talk about everything that they're going through. And so they might want to tell you everything that happened, right? Which it is their right to do and is a very normal response. Or it might be the 17th time that they were asked within the last 2 weeks. And so there's just that might affect the communication too. They might not really want to go into very much detail because they've already said this over and over again, right? So there are so many things that individually and culturally might affect the way one communicates, but the interpreter is never going to change the message for coherence, right? We have to have that very strong interpretation, knowledge, skills, and abilities to make sure that the service provider and the LEP person can work out that miscommunication, that confusion together, because that is oftentimes, that is a very normal part of communication, regardless of the language that we speak. But of course, the complexity goes up if we need to rely on an interpreter, right? And a part of what I had learned in my time at the DV essay agency is that part of the healing journey for the survivor is that maybe, right, the processing of what happened to you is the healing entails putting together a story about it and being able to process what happened to you, right? And we have to be able to meet folks wherever they are in that process of being able to talk about what they went through, right? Language often fails us, regardless of the language, to really convey certain parts of our life or certain experiences. And as interpreters, we have to be ready to meet them where they are, right? And it's especially hard too when a very common occurrence of maybe compassion fatigue and lack of cultural resources are apparent in the situation as well, right? We might see that the service provider is also going through that compassion fatigue, which is very normal in this field. And that also is in connection to not having those cultural resources to really meet this person where they're at, right? They might not have that amazing bilingual advocate in the room or around to really help them fill in those gaps. And of course, as the interpreter, we're aware of these elements happening, but it is not within our scope of practice to step in because those things are happening. But of course, when we allow the conversation to happen, we can take away maybe patterns overall and be advocates for language access too, right? Which is ultimately where I ended up as well. And so now that we've discussed the importance of the message integrity and the role of the interpreter, I'd like to finish off with the concept of trauma-informed interpretation and healing-centered interpretation. So of course, interpreters know and are aware and center safety, and safety is directly connected to one's ability to be able to communicate, right? And so this is very important when we're working with survivors, right? And we have to maintain that confidentiality, the neutrality to ensure physical and psychological safety for the survivor. And the accurate interpretation helps survivors make those informed decisions about their safety, right? And ultimately, interpretation hopefully is leading up to empowerment too, right? The advocate empowers survivors to on their healing journey and on their stabilization journey, and we have that same goal, right? And through accurate and complete interpretation, we empower folks to speak on their own experience, be an expert on their own experience, and make their own decisions and choices. And we're informed by that understanding of trauma and healing, right? As interpreters, we should walk into the room knowing maybe kind of there's a pattern, right? Just as advocates know, maybe there's a pattern or there are things that we can look out for and be responsive to, right? We have to be prepared for that nonlinear narrative or the emotional responses because we're centering communicative autonomy and equitable communication. Communicative autonomy meaning that you are the person who is the most impacted by what we are talking about, and so you should be really the leader in this conversation, and no one should get in the way of what you want to say or hear, right? And equitable communication meaning that everybody now is on the same playing field, right? We're not centering one language or one voice over another, right? Everybody is the expert of their own experience. All right, so I'm going to close off then with some tips and best practices. And I do invite interpreters in the room to chime in if there's anything else you'd like to add. Please feel free, okay? And so do please let the interpreter make their introduction. So part of interpreter training, it's very important that the interpreter be able to tell everybody in the room basically what to expect, right? And get everyone on the same page about, hello, my name is, everything you say is confidential, everything you say will be interpreted, et cetera, et cetera. It's really quick, 30 seconds, and we're repeating it in both languages, right? We're repeating it in our working language and in English, right? In these cases. And that's just to set the tone. Everyone should expect that really everything is going to be interpreted. There's never any expectation of a side conversation happening. We're really not a part of the conversation as interpreters. It's also for the spoken consecutive interpretation, those pauses are really, really important, right? Actually, the more pauses you take, the faster it goes, right? As you had seen in the beginning, the longer the speech, right, the more details you have to remember. And of course, the harder it is to remember lists, dates, names, sequences, etc. We never want to get any of those details wrong. And of course, we are trained to have a very large cache or a memory bank essentially, and a really good recall. But of course, it really does help us out, and it really does ensure accurate interpretation the more you pause. And so I do invite you to look out for that. If you notice someone is speaking for long moments of time, do ask them for that pause, because you want to hear everything, and let them know, I want to hear everything you're saying. So can we pause to let the interpreter speak? Yeah, Alicia?
On that note, with the pauses, make sure that when you end, you've ended with a complete thought. Don't
Yes.
end in the middle of a sentence or a middle of an idea just to let us catch up. That having that full thought there that we can be able to construct as we are taking our symbols and moving them along.
Yeah. Pro tip, definitely. Yeah, it's very normal also maybe to have an incomplete thought or figure out what you're trying to say as you're saying it. And so when it's relayed exactly as it is said, right, meaning for meaning, it might not make sense on the other side. And especially right with simultaneous interpretation, you have to hear the entire idea or most of the idea to be able to start relaying the rest of the message, right? Especially when it comes to syntax and everything. Yeah. I think I saw something in the chat. Oh, okay, great. I'm glad this is very helpful to you all. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so those pauses are really important, right? And I would ask you, right, as service providers as well, to keep those pauses in mind as you're speaking as well. Direct speech is also really important. So as we heard in the beginning, right, we don't use third person as interpreters. We're not a part of the conversation. We are conduits. And so you're going to hear first person. You're going to hear my name is, or I did this, etc. And so instead of asking, right, can you ask her what her name is, or can you ask her what her phone number is? With the interpreter, you ask, hi, my name is, I would like to get your phone number. I need your date of birth. Can you give me your phone number, etc. That direct speech is really important, right? Because the conversation really is with the survivor or the LAP or hard of hearing individual, not with the interpreter. And that survivor and provider communication is really important to developing that relationship and the rapport, etc. Conversation is not with the interpreter. So again, first person, right? And briefing the interpreter with details is very important, right? A lot of trauma-informed language access and incorporating interpretation into your trauma-informed practices is really thinking about it all beforehand, before it happens, right? So briefing the interpreter on what kind of general themes of what we're going to be talking about. Of course, no confidential information, but really preparing the interpreter for what they're about to walk into. Because part of our code of ethics is to report any impediments to performance. And so that means, right, maybe I'm uncomfortable with this topic. I'm not going to be able to maintain accuracy and neutrality. I'm going to have to pass it on to someone else. That's something that's really important for interpreters to know before they walk into the session, of course. For example, one of the first sessions that I interpreted for was at a child advocacy center at a time where I did not know what a child advocacy center was. And I was pulled in to interpret for a forensic interview with a 14-year-old and content warning, right? There was sexual assault, right? And I really was not prepared with the information to go into that session and know what I was walking into, right? And so that experience really informs a lot of what I did with the interpreter bank years later, right, with the DBSA agency, and just really briefing interpreters about, hey, this is the organization, this is what they do, these are the kinds of clients they tend to work with, or these kinds of cases. Is this something that you're comfortable with? And really screening them and making sure that we're being trauma informed with the interpreter, because obviously the ability to do their job accurately and completely and in a trauma-informed way starts with them being able to have autonomy and be able to collaborate in the space, right? And so as many details as possible before the session is super important and really welcome. And please do not ask the interpreter to fill out documents with the client by themselves, right? We as interpreters, we're trained on interpreting. We're not trained on what this document means, what this question means, how it's going to be used, etc. And so that would not be happening, right, if everyone spoke the same language. And so we're happy to interpret for you, right, as you help the client fill out the document. And of course, another best practice would be to have that document translated if possible. But this could be a unauthorized practice of law also, depending on the situation, asking us to fill out a form with the client by ourselves. Please also do not ask the client to, I'm sorry, let me start over. Please do not leave the interpreter alone in the room with the survivor. Why is this? Because the interpreter might reflect parts of their cultural identity, maybe nationality. It's the first time, right, in this building that you've spoken to someone in your own language, or that you hear your own language, right? So maybe there's this inherent shared trust that develops between the client or the survivor and the interpreter, right? The interpreter is supposed to stay completely neutral, right? And they might relay or share information with the interpreter that they otherwise didn't want to share with the service provider or with the lawyer, right? But the interpreter has the obligation to stay neutral and actually repeat everything that is said, even if you leave the room, right? And as soon as you come back, I have the obligation to relay that information to you, or to really sit with this information that might impact the case, or we feel conflicted about not telling you, etc. And so just to avoid opening that door altogether, we're going to leave the room with you, even if it's just to make a copy of something, to get a document. If you get up, we're going to get up with you, and we're maybe going to just stand right outside the door, just to avoid any possibility of developing that more personal relationship with the survivor, right? Because we really want to maintain the accuracy and completeness, and that is the way that we are helping, right? And please do look out for those side conversations. Like I said before, the interpreter should not be giving opinions. They should not be telling anyone what to say, or summarizing, or redirecting the survivor. If you notice that side conversation, do address it, and do address it with maybe with the interpreter coordinator, etc. Really, the interpreter should not be part of the conversation at all. And like I had said before, the cultural background is that information is going to come from the client directly, and not the interpreter, right? We're not anthropologists, we're not cultural experts, and we definitely don't want to speak on anyone's behalf, right? So if you have any questions about culture, do ask the client directly. And it really is also, again, this comes before the session starts. This comes before you call the interpreter in. Service providers should also have that cultural training, the cultural responsive training before we go into the session, right? There is a learning curve, but it happens with the folks who participate in that culture, not with the interpreter. Right? Some other considerations: everything will be interpreted. So this includes any side remarks to your colleague, any side remarks the survivor makes to their friend that they brought to the appointment, any side remarks they make to the interpreter, right? Expecting you, the interpreter, not to repeat it, right? And what happens is really uncomfortable. What comes after that, right? You might not expect the interpreter to repeat it, but it's our obligation to repeat everything, right? And so please, if you do not want it interpreted, please do not say it, right? And that's actually part of our introduction, right? Everything you say will be interpreted. So please be mindful of that. And one voice at a time is really important too. Communication breaks down really fast if we start talking over one another, or if one person starts to respond to the other before the interpretation is finished, right? Thoughts and messages just get lost completely, and the interpreter cannot interpret two voices at a time. And we definitely don't want to make a decision about whose voice is more important to interpret or anything. And so please do consider one voice at a time. Positioning is also very important. For spoken language interpretation, we really want to avoid the triangle where we're all facing each other because we don't want the perception that the interpreter is part of the conversation. Best practice would be to have the interpreter sit slightly behind and beside one of you, either the survivor or the service provider. But of course, for ASL interpreters, that triangle positioning might be more common, actually necessary, because you need to see the signing as someone is speaking, right? And so please do consider the positioning when you have the session or the appointment with the client, right? As well as the timing as well. The timing might take a little bit longer than a session without the interpretation, just because we're having to, if it's consecutive, repeat the message. So it takes double the amount of time, or there just might be more clarifications happening, etc. And so again, a lot of preparation beforehand comes with calling the interpreter in and being trauma informed in your language access practices. And a debrief with the interpreter is also a great practice, just to be trauma informed with them. Just to process kind of what happened during the session, give them any feedback, essentially. That is a great trauma-informed practice for working with interpreters. And of course, clarifications do happen amongst interpreters, and that is something that we have been trained to do, that we have a lot of practice with. It should be very fast and efficient. We don't want to make assumptions about what you're saying, right? If we don't understand something, or if the AC came on, or a dog barked outside, or maybe you were shuffling papers around the microphone, if it's a phone call and I didn't hear what you said, I might ask for a repetition, I might ask for a clarification. Or on the other side, right, if there's a word that is very regionally distinct. For example, in Spanish, there are more than 20 countries that speak Spanish. And so there is slang that comes up. There are regionally specific words that maybe I'm not familiar with, right? And so I don't want to make assumptions, and I'm going to ask. I'm going to make a clarification, ask for a clarification, but it's never going to be a side conversation. I'm repeating everything that is said. I'm going to ask, the interpreter needs a clarification. The interpreter needs a clarification. What does this word mean? What does this word mean? It means this. So it's very fast, but it is all interpreted. And so do look out for that and be prepared for that, right? We don't want to make any mistakes. And note-taking is a part of consecutive interpretation, especially for those spoken language interpreters. That's actually our secret to being able to memorize as much content as possible at a time. We develop a set of personal symbols to prompt memory recall. Our memory is very flexible, right? We can actually develop a larger cache of memory, or over time, if we don't use our memory in certain ways, it might decrease. But with interpreters with a lot of experience and note-taking, we're able to hold on to more information and memorize. And our note-taking helps us with recall with our personal symbols, but it's never going to be written out verbatim, and we don't want to have confidential information on our notes or anything. That is something that we look out for as well. But it is a trauma-informed practice for interpreters. We never want to ask someone to repeat themselves, especially if it's the more graphic content or just the more sensitive content that we're asking someone to repeat. We do want to avoid that at all costs. So note-taking is actually a really important part of trauma-informed interpretation, but those notes are going to be destroyed during the meeting or even right after, right? Best practice that I talk to interpreters about is just destroying those notes in front of the survivor, right? Kind of just off to a corner by the trash can, just letting them know we're not leaving with any of this information, but it is really important to have those note-taking skills. Okay, so I did talk to you about a lot of information today, so I would love to hear from you all. If you have any questions, any opinions, and if there are any parts of this training that you feel like we could delve into more next time, or if you want just to chat about any other parts of this this practice, please feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to talk to you about it. So I'll just open it up and see if there are any questions. Alicia?
Yes, just first of all, thank you so much. You covered like all of the things. My only other quick tip I would put out there is making sure that they have contracts set up with multiple agencies ahead of time. It's easier to have that ahead of time before the crisis actually happens, and making sure that they are agencies that may have a variety of open scheduled hours and with interpreters with multiple skill sets. Because like you, I had started off that way, and it took a lot to learn all of the domestic violence and sexual assault and trauma-informed care, and not everybody has that. And so you don't want to have somebody in there that's going to re-traumatize a situation or not be able to handle that situation. So multiple contracts, multiple agencies.
So well said. Thank you so much for sharing that. Exactly. Yeah. A lot of preparation really comes before that, a lot of thought. And of course, we want to learn from the moments where maybe those bases were not covered. But yes, the focus is definitely not re-traumatizing and really being realistic about, you know, what people's capacities are, what different organizations' capacities and specialties are. Exactly. Thank you so much for sharing that. Any other questions or thoughts? Or any other tips from our interpreters?
I do have the question in that, I noticed that this was recorded. Is this something that I could be able to refer some of our newer interpreters to, just to start to get their feet wet?
I'll answer that. This is
Mhm.
Kathy from CCASA. This recording will be up on our YouTube channel.
Mhm.
That will be, if you go to ccasa.org and then click on the YouTube symbol, then it will be up there in a couple of days.
Hey,
Or
wonderful.
by
And
the
also,
first part of next week.
oh, great. And then the other thing too is sometimes when I'm in these situations, I find really helpful is if the advocate can also do some advocacy for us as well. If, say, if we're in a situation with, say, a SANE or a police officer or someone like that who is not used to using an interpreter as much, and you find that they are continually staring at the interpreter or saying, will you tell them? Sometimes if the advocate can just simply say, oh, you could just talk directly to the patient or the victim, and just help to direct that. And it helps to keep us centered in our role too. Just in facilitating without having to break from that too.
Yes, dream team when everyone's, well, when the
Yes.
advocate is on the same page about, you know, what it looks like when the interpreter and the advocate and really everyone else can work together. It makes the job so much easier for everybody, right? I loved working with the advocates at the DBSA agency I was at before. We knew kind of what our roles were and we could support each other. And definitely the advocate would talk to service providers and their client about, hey, so we're going to invite our interpreter in, and just so you know, they're going to repeat everything, and this is what it's going to look like, and this is what it's going to feel like. Maybe there's a role play that happens, what it's going to feel like, because it is kind of an unnatural dynamic to have another person in proximity as kind of part of the conversation, but not. And so for sure, inviting advocates to also be language access advocates and really
Yes.
and just advocate for the best working conditions possible for the interpreter, right? Interpreters are trained to advocate for those things as well, but of course it really helps when other people are able to support you in that and redirect folks and yeah, just reaffirm, right, what the expectations are for sure.
Even simple things like because some of these sticky situations, they only want to have like one person in the room. Oh, well, the interpreter's here, that's the one person. No, if someone is going to have support, we're staff, we're the fly on the wall, we're just communication facilitators. We are not the support person for the victim.
Exactly, right. So if someone asks us a question as the interpreter, hey, do you know what this means? Or like, hey, do you, you know, if they ask a question to the interpreter is just going to interpret the question. That's actually what is going to happen. And maybe it takes a little bit of time to get used to that for some folks. But once we see really the results of, oh, okay, this person is really taking charge of the conversation, everybody is participating in this, it works so well. And I think people walk away really understanding what it looks like when it works well, and why it's important to advocate for those working conditions for sure. Thank you for sharing and for chiming in. All right, so I see a question in the chat that says, can you talk about the implications maybe for an advocate interpreting for someone in a criminal case? We have had the DA try to make one of our advocates interpret instead of hiring an interpreter. Yeah, so has anyone else kind of witnessed this, and do we have any kind of experiences that we can share about like what happened in that situation? Any adverse outcomes?
I have,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily in with a DA, but just in any role where the person is not a trained interpreter. They don't have the same linguistic ability, the same vocabulary structure that those of us who are trained, especially once we get to this level of handling sexual assault, domestic violence, that there are going to be linguistic issues that happen. There's going to be miscommunications, and it can
Mm-hmm.
impact the case.
Exactly. Yeah. Bottom line is going to impact the case. It's going to change results for the survivor. The message changes, the results change, right? So there might be summarizing that happens. There might be details that are lost, right? The advocate might be tempted maybe to speak for the survivor because that's actually what their role is sometimes, is to kind of advocate for them and to maybe answer questions on their behalf. But when an interpreter has a completely different way of operating in the courtroom, in conversations, etc. And so, of course, that might jeopardize the outcomes of the case. The survivor might not actually get the means of safety that they were asking for. And it really also muddles the lines for future interpreters and that judge or the lawyer or the survivor, right? They might have different expectations. But ultimately, the advocate is trained to advocate and not to interpret, which is accurate and complete rendering of an entire message, especially when it comes to a legal case, right? Hannah, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think that's all really good information. I think I totally understand a lot of that as implications. But I think what could be, I think the instances that I'm talking about specifically are just like interactions with the DA, not necessarily like in court. And so I'm just wondering if there's any sort of like compelling arguments for how that can compromise like confidentiality. If because that's like I think that's kind of my impression that it could compromise confidentiality and um between the survivor and the advocate, as far as like if the defense were to find out about that, like could they potentially like subpoena someone and like because of, yeah, I don't know. I just wasn't sure if anyone has any information on that or some sort of compelling arguments in that regard, that I think that could like help, because we've talked to the DA um about these other reasons, like we can't fully do our jobs as an advocate if we're also being an interpreter and we aren't trained to be an interpreter, you know. But I'm just wondering if there's maybe some more compelling reasons to them, because it seems like those are sometimes not really taken as seriously. Do you know does that make sense what I'm saying?
I hear what you're saying.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. You don't know how other people might use that information of an unqualified interpreter maybe playing that role, and or just what are other compelling reasons to advocate for an interpreter to be hired and invited into the session, et cetera. Yeah, I think everything that you're saying is really valid. And one thing that I know to be true is that maybe if an unqualified interpreter is in the room interpreting, and the lawyer is trying to prepare the client to take the witness stand, etc., or to do something else, right? If the the narrative doesn't match up for some reason once you get on the stand and we have a detail that maybe changes everything, right, and is going to compromise the rest of the outcomes. I would emphasize that piece as well. About the subpoenaing, I feel like it might differ across states. I would ask my colleagues in the room if you have any information about that. I would have to do research, honestly, to answer that piece. But really just we might not be getting all of the details. And I think that's something that you have advocated for a lot. And I wish you a lot of just luck with that, and definitely feel free to reach out to us if there's if you would like any more individual TA around this, technical assistance, to talk to folks in your area or who you're working with about language access practices to maybe make that case for you as well. And so, and I invite other folks in the room too, if you would like individual technical assistance around specific challenges that you're facing with language access, and would like support for advocating for those better working conditions, definitely feel free to reach out to us, and we can work with you on that.
Thank you.
Of course. Jose Juan said, the danger is the judgment can be turned on appeal and puts into question credibility of the alleged interpreter. Did you want to elaborate on that at all, Jose Juan?
Sure. Well, I mean, it has a domino effect, right? And so if that does happen, then any court certified interpreter that's used by the court, again, any smart, any proficient, I should say, defense attorney is going to use it in the court system. Also, that could lead to putting the jurisdiction under consent decree by the Department of Justice, which impacts funding and all those things. So I strongly recommend to that. I would also recommend contacting your state's Office of Court Administrators and find out what is their process to request a court certified interpreter. Sometimes people may not know. And so that's important to have, especially as advocates. I would recommend that you do that. Usually that information is posted on their website. It's also a training issue. So if this is something that you would like us to do a training, because we've done trainings for judges, we've done training for Office of Court Administrators, whatever. So if that's something that's of interest, you definitely can reach out to us and we can kind of maybe start that conversation. There's also Title VI of the Civil Rights Act clearly states that any entity, jurisdiction that receives funding from the state or federal government must provide language access, and they must also have a language access plan. Executive Order 13166 also clarified that in the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And so obviously this includes courts, law enforcement agencies, domestic violence and rape crisis centers, anyone that receives any type of state or federal funding, and also provides life-saving services. So schools, hospitals, everyone here right now is required to have a language access plan and provide linguistically accessible services. Yes, ADA laws are very clear about that as well. Because if you have a litigant that's requires sign language, they must provide a sign interpreter. They must, because that is ADA federal law. So yeah, so there's
Thank you. Yeah, I knew that about, all of those agencies that have to provide that. We've had some pushback where it's like, oh, interpreters aren't available at our Immigration Resource Center. And like we also utilize them for interpretation, but we also have like a backup plan for interpretation if someone isn't available in person. And so it's like really frustrating to hear them say that, because we're also like a nonprofit and we're still providing that adequately yet, so, but I have some good ideas and contacts, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
There's also the National Center for State Courts. They've done a lot of extensive training with judges in state courts around language access. If you just Google them and go to their website, they have a whole tab on language access. So that's another possibility. So yeah, so it's just a matter of what you prioritize. And if you belong to any type of coordinated community response or multidisciplinary task force or what have you, I mean, I definitely always bring this up. Like, I'm sure you already do this, but always bring this up around language access. I think this is also an area where coalitions can get involved a little bit more. Right? And just build the capacity of advocates on what are the federal mandates around providing linguistically accessible services, which is again Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Executive Order 13166, American with Disabilities Act. There's also other federal acts that are also very clear about language access or providing access to diverse community members, regardless of how they identify or their ability to communicate. Yeah, and sometimes it just requires to have an outside person to come and have this conversation. So we again at API-GBV we've worked with state agencies, municipalities, law enforcement entities, courts, and so on. And if the other thing is, if you find a judge that is friendly and understands these issues, it's just good to build those relationships and just kind of see how we can build meaningful collaborations with that judge. Same thing with law enforcement. If there's a friendly law enforcement officer to the cause, kind of build that relationship. And there's ways of doing that, right? But it's just going to take time and just kind of say, well, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says that, and the Executive Order 13166 says. And also we understand that it's also a capacity issue. We know that during COVID, a lot of interpreters left the profession for a lot of reasons, least of that trauma and all of that. And so there is and it's not an excuse, but across the board, there is a scarcity of court certified interpreters or just experienced qualified interpreters across the board. And we're hearing this from everywhere. And so that tells me then that is as colleagues and partners for folks who are professional interpreters, what do we need to do to kind of support and replenish that scarcity, right? What is it that we can do to make sure that when we go into these spaces, we emphasize the importance of an interpreter? Because I'm here to tell you that as a baby advocate, I was trained about the important role of the judge, law enforcement, other victim service providers, everyone else except interpreters in those critical spaces, which is a court hearing, wherever. And so now that we have this information, you as advocates have to learn about what an interpreter does. And I think like Alicia mentioned, converse to that conversation. There's a lot of interpreters that just don't understand what trauma is because they feel they're not going to be impacted by it. And that's not true. But there's also research that says that often the skills that interpreters provide are not valued or uplifted or affirmed. Because again, it's this, and I think it just feeds into that conversation because like, well, I'm just a mouthpiece, I'm just a bridge for communication. But the reality is like you are interpreting or even translating, like Tomiko said, all these things that you have to find cultural linguistic nuances to make sure that conveys the message, which you're going to carry that forward. And then there's also research that says that vicarious trauma does exist among the field of interpreters. And actually a lot of national interpreter professional associations has become a topic of training and discourse probably in the last 10 years to my research into this field. So that's a lot to say, but we can have an offline conversation and just continue it. But I think if we as advocates and as interpreters who are in these spaces kind of collaborate, cross-train each other and say, hey, if you got my back as an advocate and say, Your Honor, yes, they're bilingual advocates in the space, but they are not a court certified interpreter. And but that also takes courage to go up against the judge who's told you, Alicia, I have this litigant, but they speak Portuguese and you speak Spanish, right? And so that also takes a lot of courage. And so all those things.
Hannah, this is Agatha. Are you from Colorado?
Yes.
Okay, so what I have seen in my experience here in the state is that sometimes what works is to find a DA from another area in Colorado who is really, really, really all up for language access and having them peer to peer the pressure to them to say, hey, you have to bring this out. It is a lot. It is all of that. If you want, we can connect to as well. And I mean, Jose Juan and API are fantastic on those things. But yes, as I have seen that has worked here in Colorado, where we partnered up the agency who needs it in that region with another agency. A lot of metro area, Boulder is one of them that I know has always gone out to the rural areas to help those DAs, especially when it's a new DA who just graduated and they're like adamant to do these things. The peer pressure and the shadowing or whatever you're mentoring, then that makes them to really make the change and really put that as an important aspect of the services that they have to provide. That's what I have seen in Colorado here before.
Great. Thank you. And just to clarify, it is a ADA. So I think it's sort of more about the actual DA like he agrees with it when we talk to him, but I think it's more of him like sort of enforcing that and holding his employees accountable. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for the question, and to Jose Juan and Agueda for the really great information and tips. I thought that, I learned a lot from that moment. So thank you for asking that question, Hannah. I'll pass it over to you, Kathy, to close us out.
Hey, thank you, Tomika and Jose Juan and Agatha and Alicia for all the great information. Tomika, this has been wonderful. This is so impactful and powerful, and I know everyone has learned a lot from what you've shared today. Attendees, you will be getting a copy of the presentation, and I did pop into the chat a couple of surveys, one from Sikasa, and asking you what you thought of the webinar and asking for any of your advice on any webinars you would like to see in the future. And then there was another one from Asian Pacific, and if you would fill that out for them. And like I said, you will be receiving all this information and all the resources that were shared. I will try to put those all in an email to you as well. So thank you again for attending, and we will see you next time. And there are 2 more of this series next week on the 21st and 22nd. So if you'd like to register for those, if you haven't already, then please do. So thank you for attending.